All right, let's dive right into this explainer. For the better part of 2 decades, we've had this incredibly dominant cultural narrative about struggling marriages, right? But today, we're unpacking some fascinating source material that suggests reality is actually way more complex than we've been led to believe. We're going to look at a highly structured, impartial breakdown of this exact dynamic.
You know the story. The source points to this universally accepted myth, the one you see everywhere, from therapy offices to social media to endless self-help books. It essentially claims that the husband is the fundamental, structural obstacle to the marriage his wife deserves. This narrative casts him as completely oblivious and resistant, while casting his partner as the emotionally intelligent one doing all the heavy lifting. It's a story so common, honestly, most of us have just stopped questioning whether it's actually an accurate reflection of reality.
Well, we're going to impartially flip the script a bit. The material deconstructs this dynamic using 7 distinct dimensions of reality. It asks us to pop the hood, look at the mechanical interior of these relationships, and see how a man who is actively trying to solve a problem is often systematically prevented from doing so, all without automatically slapping him with the label of the villain. So let's start right off the bat with Dimension 1 resolution mode versus character trial. Okay, picture this. When a man decides to actually bring up a difficult subject, he's making a highly vulnerable bet. He's betting he can bring a problem to his partner to efficiently shrink it. The source defines this internal decision as resolution mode. Basically, he's actively risking the peace of the moment because he trusts his partner to act as a collaborator. He just wants to make the problem smaller by the end of the chat. And the author argues that understanding this specific approach is absolutely crucial. It's not just some minor communication glitch. It's the core mechanism of how genuine communication gets twisted into relationship damage. Because here is the trap. He comes in with a goal to shrink a specific problem, right? But almost instantly, the subject is entirely replaced by a trial of his tone, his timing, and his historical character. The specific thing he actually came to address is quietly swept out of the room, and suddenly he's on the stand defending himself against charges he didn't even know he was facing. His genuine attempt to solve something is literally converted into evidence of his failure. To really bring this to life, this source highlights a guy named Conrad. He's an engineer who completely stopped raising issues after 10 years of marriage. Why? Because the cost of constantly defending himself became way higher than just absorbing the problems in silence. Conrad's entire professional life revolves around solving problems. But at home, raising an issue just produced instant counterattacks. So he ended up carrying around this massive, heavy backpack full of unsolved problems that he was simply no longer permitted to unpack. Which brings us naturally to dimensions 2 and 3, performance and accountability. Over time, this daily communication breakdown morphs into serious systemic environmental pressure. This leads to what the source cleverly calls a conflict performance. And here's the kicker. This performance isn't designed to produce mutual understanding at all. It is strictly designed to force his concession just to restore the peace. Think about it. Genuine conflict narrows toward a resolution, but a performance expands. It uses emotional maximization, like cranking up the volume or using tears addressed directly to him as an audience. The only exit door from this performance? Total surrender, which conveniently buries the original problem forever. And that leads right into the asymmetry of accountability. In this dynamic, his failures are put under a microscope, scrutinized granularly. But any attempt to examine her behavior? That's immediately deflected as an attack on her character. The source notes the double standard clearly. If his behavior causes a problem, he is fully expected to own it and change. But if her behavior causes a problem, simply naming it triggers that massive conflict performance we just talked about. Let's be real, a relationship where only one partner is allowed to be wrong isn't a partnership. It is a hierarchy.
Let's keep moving and explore dimensions 4 and 5, unmet needs and fictional husbands.
These dimensions look at the wild internal and external standards placed on men in these struggling marriages. According to the material, her emotional needs are treated as the absolute gold standard, requiring constant, perfect accommodation. Meanwhile, his stress, his interior life, often just dismissed as mere background noise. Culturally, we demand men be emotionally available, but in these specific dynamics, if he actually expresses his struggle, it's either totally dismissed as an overreaction, or worse, weaponized as proof that he isn't providing what she needs. So he quickly learns his emotional life simply isn't safe there. To make matters infinitely worse, his authentic, real-life self is constantly being measured against completely fictional highlight reels of optimized husbands that literally do not exist. As the source points out,
Modern marriage exists in a media environment of heavily curated presentations. He is not competing with real flesh and blood men. He is competing with an aggregate social media highlight reel that totally edits out the arguments, the bad weeks, and those boring, ordinary Tuesday evenings. It is a standard that is entirely constructed, not lived.
All right, on to dimension 6, invisible sacrifices.
When we look at the long-term existential fatigue of this dynamic, the source notes something profound. Because he consistently provides and absorbs stress day in and day out, his sacrifices actually become normalized. They just turn into the invisible furniture of their lives. The long hours worked, the intense stress managed completely in private so it doesn't land on the family. These active daily expressions of care just stop being acknowledged. They become the baseline condition of the family's life, and falling anywhere below that means he's failing.
But in stark contrast to that invisible baseline of success, every single minor shortcoming is amplified to define his entire adequacy as a husband. Every single failed domestic task or moment he wasn't perfectly present is named, filed away, and returned to repeatedly. The source makes a really compelling argument here. Any counting system that treats a man's massive daily contributions as just expected, while treating his minor shortcomings as the whole story, is fundamentally dishonest.
Which brings us to the climax of the source material, Dimension 7, Reaching Clarity Without Bitterness. The material lands on describing the overarching reality a man finds himself in after years, sometimes decades of genuine effort. The author notes that these men didn't just bail when things got tough. They stayed. They went to therapy, and not just to perform compliance, but engaging genuinely. They tried to keep an honest channel open despite massive structural incentives to just shut down entirely. They took their vows seriously. They read the books, adjusted their behavior, and kept trying because they sincerely believed that if they just kept offering sustained effort, they would eventually save their relationship.
But here is the tragic realization described in the source. Despite all of that agonizing effort and adaptation, the narrative of the relationship never actually changed. He was just never, ever going to be enough. He essentially remained faithful to a story that greedily absorbed all his growth and effort, only to spit out the exact same conclusion year after year. The script was set in stone, and his role as the fundamental problem was completely non-negotiable.
But listen closely. This is absolutely not the story of a bitter man giving up. As the source beautifully articulates, it is the objective, peaceful clarity of a man finally separating himself from a script written by people who just desperately needed a villain. The peace he eventually finds isn't some sad consolation prize for failure. He didn't fail the marriage. According to the author, he simply exceeded what the marriage was actually capable of receiving.
And that is exactly why understanding this dynamic impartially matters so deeply. Because recognizing reality, without holding on to bitterness, is literally the only way a person can honestly build forward. The source stresses that this entire reevaluation isn't about just assigning blame in the other direction. No, it's about a man finally understanding clearly what he experienced, dropping the false narrative, and moving forward with a solid, totally honest foundation. So I want to leave you with a really powerful thought to reflect on from today's source material. If you have lived through this exact dynamic, we genuinely want to hear your real account. When did that clarity finally arrive for you? Real accounts from people who have actually lived this are worth 1,000 times more than any theory. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always look a little closer at the stories we're told to accept as default.